He was a Kentucky boy who wanted to fly. He enlisted in the Air Force during the Korean War, but the war ended before he saw action. Desperate to prove himself, he was ordered to a secret base in New Mexico to learn the art of nuclear warfare. Bored even with that, he considered leaving the Air Force when a mysterious stranger offered him the opportunity to try something new. He became a member of the elite squadron of U-2 pilots, working not for the Air Force, but for the CIA. He flew missions so secret he couldn't even tell his family, until in 1960, he was shot down over the Soviet Union. At that moment, he ceased being a pilot and became instead a pawn in a geopolitical chess game he barely understood. He is Francis Gary Powers, and he is a legend of air power. Francis Gary Powers was born on August 17, 1929, the only boy in a family of 6 children, the son of a coal miner. There are not too many lives harder than the life of a Depression-era coal miner. Work was intermittent and paid badly when it was available. Powers' father, Oliver, wanted his son to be a doctor. During World War II, coal miners worked overtime. For the first time, the Powers family had a little money. At a county fair, Oliver paid $2.50 to buy his 14-year-old son a short ride in a small plane.
And after he flew in this biplane, he came back down and he told my grandparents, his parents, that he'd left his heart up there. So that was his very first experience with flying, and from that moment on, he knew that he wanted to be a pilot.
Desperate to contribute to the war effort, Powers planned to join the Navy after his high school graduation. The war ended, however, before he could enlist. He enrolled at his father's behest in tiny Milligan College in Tennessee. There, surrounded by veterans attending college on the GI Bill, he concluded that history had passed him by. During his senior year, he applied to the Air Force Cadets. He took the test, passed, and had only to sign the papers upon his graduation. His father, however, had other plans and convinced Francis, despite the outbreak of war in Korea, to return home and await his draft notice. A short time there convinced Francis otherwise, and in October 1950, 2 months after turning 21, he enlisted in the Air Force in hopes that he would qualify as a pilot. He trained at Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, learned photography at Lowry Air Force Base in Denver, and then was assigned as a photo technician. He applied again for the Air Cadets. Finally accepted in November 1951, he reported for flight school. He learned to fly in a T-6, a heavy, obsolete 1930s fighter that served longer and more honorably as a trainer. He hustled through training and soloed after only 20 hours in the air. He wrote years later how wonderful it had felt being alone in the air, totally responsible for his actions. After 6 months, he went on to advanced flight training. He checked out on jets and earned a reputation as a totally unflappable pilot, calm, confident, and self-contained, who wanted nothing more than to serve his country in combat. He graduated from the cadets in 1952. His last stop before Korea was gunnery school. There, he came down with appendicitis. The delay cost him dearly. Washed back to the next class, the war ended before he graduated. For the second time, history had passed him by. In October 1953, he went to New Mexico to learn how to drop nuclear weapons from fighter aircraft. He was given, in effect, his own piece of the American battle plan. A base to report to, a plane to fly, a route into the Soviet airspace, and a target to hit. In 1954, he made first lieutenant and married Barbara Gay Moore, an 18-year-old he'd met the year before. He had decided to serve out his enlistment and become an airline pilot. As his separation date approached, he contacted several airlines and discovered that he was too old to be considered for airline training. So, with a wife to support and no other options, he re-enlisted. Little did Powers know that in the Nevada desert, in a restricted area that would come to be known as Area 51, the United States government was testing a new kind of airplane, a spy plane, capable of flying higher than the anti-aircraft weapons of its time could reach. The U-2, as the secret craft was known, was designed and built for a very specific mission: to fly over the Soviet Union east of the Ural Mountains, an area the size of Canada that was sealed off to Western eyes. There, the Soviet Union had built whole cities dedicated to the development of new weapon systems, cities that the West had no way to peer into. The idea of flying over the area was not new. The United States had modified strategic bombers to serve as spy planes. They had the range but could not fly high enough to avoid Soviet radar and guns. But the U-2 would be different. It would fly with impunity, above the range of even the most advanced Russian radar. It could overfly and photograph the most secret Soviet installations and return safely to base. Intelligence gathering with the U-2 would become businesslike, regular, commonplace. President Eisenhower approved the project almost without hesitation. He believed that knowing what the Russians were doing in their blacked-out hinterlands held the key to protecting America from the nuclear war people like Francis Powers were preparing to fight. In late 1955, Francis Gary Powers returned from a training mission and saw his name written on a blackboard in the pilot ready room. He reported to Wing Headquarters, where a major asked him if he was interested in a civilian job. Powers asked for details, which the major refused to provide. Instead, he told Powers to go to an off-base motel for a meeting.
He was recruited for the CIA U-2 program. He volunteered for several reasons. One, it was doing something patriotic for his country. One, it was flying a new type of airplane that no one had ever flown before, so there was the thrill of adventure. And three, it was a wonderful pay increase.
After several conversations with the CIA agent, in April, Powers resigned his commission in the Air Force and became officially a civilian. While pilots in the Air Force were taking home barely $400 a month, Powers and the other U-2 pilots started at $1,500 during training and went up to $2,000 when they deployed overseas. The small corps of U-2 pilots assembled at Lockheed's facility in Burbank, California. From there, they flew by transport to a secret Air Force base in the Nevada desert called Watertown. There was, of course, no water in Watertown. A seemingly limitless expanse of desert, Watertown's key attributes were its privacy and lack of distractions. Like participants in the Manhattan Project, who were isolated in the New Mexico desert for years while they chipped away at the secrets of the atom, upon their arrival in Watertown, the U-2 pilots became a cloistered society of airborne spies.
They stepped off the plane. There was this long-winged, droopy-looking airplane, kind of looked like a mosquito with droopy wings. Some of the pilots wanted to get back on the transport and go back home. They didn't know what they had signed up for.
The U-2's wings were nearly twice as long as the fuselage, their tips kept off the tarmac by temporary wheels designed to drop off as the plane left the ground. Compared to the other aircraft of the 1950s, the U-2 seemed almost wispy. No matter what the engineers said, the Air Force believed the plane to be almost disposable, so frail that it would have to be discarded after only a few missions. Years later, Powers wrote, "Each piece of the structure was a little thinner than a pilot would have liked. It was not a plane for heavy or drastic maneuvers. My hands itched to get onto the controls." The U-2 was a very different kind of aircraft. It required only 1,000 feet of runway to take off, and then climbed at a more than 45-degree angle. In the time it took a normal aircraft to climb a few thousand feet, the U-2 could disappear into the stratosphere. The U-2 pilots regularly broke altitude records, flying more than 15 miles high, but the records were never reported. Instead, the pilots cheered their successes silently, enjoying an almost orbital view of the world. Their training was exhaustive, but failed to deal with one critical aspect of their mission. What if the plane crashed in enemy territory? Powers, in his autobiography, says he raised the topic with his commanding officer. He was told simply that if captured, he should tell the Russians everything they asked, since they were experienced at torture and would get the information eventually anyway. To a veteran of nuclear training, that sounded like conduct unbecoming an officer. He felt it was a glib dismissal of his real concerns, a dismissal based on CIA conceit that the U-2s flew too high for the Russians to shoot down. Even the manual self-destruct system, which had to be triggered by the pilot, seemed incomplete. It packed only a small charge, enough to destroy the cameras lodged in the plane's belly, but not the plane itself. The first batch of U-2s and pilots deployed to a base in England in April 1956, under cover as the 1st Weather Reconnaissance Squadron. In August, Powers moved to Incirlik Air Force Base, Turkey, as part of the 2nd Weather Reconnaissance Squadron. The first U-2 flights out of Turkey skirted the edges of Soviet airspace. Just as modern intelligence-gathering planes fly along the coast of China, the U-2s flew along the southern edge of the Soviet Empire. From high above the clouds, they eavesdropped on Soviet radio transmissions, plotting the locations of radar and anti-aircraft installations. In November, Powers made the first tentative probe of Soviet airspace. The flight went off without a hitch, and nothing he or the instruments in his plane detected showed any signs the Soviets knew he was there. It didn't take too many flights for complacency to set in. In the late 1950s, while the U-2s were flying countless spy missions over the Soviet Union, relations between the Russians and the United States began to improve. Nikita Khrushchev, who succeeded Joseph Stalin as the Soviet premier, changed the Russian strategy of unremitting hostility to the U.S. The Soviet economy was faltering, the inevitable effect of Stalin's purges and various 5-year economic plans. Khrushchev believed that trade with the West and adoption of American industrial techniques might help solve Russia's economic woes. In September 1959, Khrushchev visited the United States. He was not dour or menacing. He seemed almost clownish, a jovial, rotund emissary from the other side of the world. He proposed a massive disarmament, keeping nuclear weapons while mothballing conventional navies and air forces. In the communist world, Khrushchev's sudden fascination with the West did not play well. The Soviet military protested what they perceived as Khrushchev's slight, and the Chinese communists, vying for leadership of the many Marxist movements around the world, condemned Khrushchev as counter-revolutionary. Publicly committed to a May 1960 summit in Paris, Khrushchev seemed trapped. The West saw the summit as the most important diplomatic event since the end of World War II. The communist world saw it as more Khrushchev backsliding. The Soviet premier needed a way to back out and still save face. As the climate between East and West warmed, the number of U-2 flights decreased. Months passed without a single flight out of Incirlik Air Base, where Francis Gary Powers was stationed. And then in April 1960, apparently to provide information in preparation for the summit meeting, 2 missions were scheduled back-to-back. The first flight was normal, the pilot departing and returning to base without incident. The second, which Powers was scheduled to fly, was the most ambitious U-2 flight ever. Covering almost 4,000 miles, the 9-hour flight would pass over areas so deep in the Soviet Union, even the U-2 had not overflown them, and would end at a base in Norway. Powers packed a bag, assured his wife he'd be home in a few days, and got on a transport to Pakistan, where a U-2 was waiting for him. Delayed several days by bad weather, Powers finally took off at 6:26 a.m. May 1st. As he climbed into the sky, he clicked his radio call button twice, the signal that he was well and ready to begin his mission. That was the last anyone heard of Francis Gary Powers and his U-2 for a while.
My uncle told me a story about how the 2 or 3 gentlemen in suits came down to the family farm, knocked on the door. My grandmother answered, and she was informed that Francis, as the family called him, was missing. The family was devastated. For the first 5 days, they didn't know whether my father was alive or dead.
In Turkey, the public information officer announced that an unarmed weather plane operated by NASA had disappeared. Privately, the CIA was sure Powers was dead. Powers was, however, alive. Shot down over Sverdlovsk, he became Khrushchev's secret weapon, his excuse to back out of the Paris summit, and a tool to embarrass the American president on the world stage. On May 5th, the premier told the Supreme Soviet that an American aircraft had invaded Soviet territory and had, on his personal order, been shot down. On May 6th, the State Department spokesman stated categorically that there was no deliberate attempt to violate Soviet airspace and called Khrushchev's accusation monstrous. On May 7th, Khrushchev sprang his trap, pulling out of the summit and announcing to the world that he had the pilot alive. Suddenly, it was Eisenhower who was trapped. On May 11th, he admitted that the United States government had been lying and that he had authorized the flights. He called aerial spying a distasteful necessity of the Cold War. He had, in effect, signed Powers' confession.
My father was interrogated for 90 days, from about May 7th up through August 15th, which was the day of his trial. He was interrogated approximately 16 hours per day for 90 days. A bright spotlight, a good KGB agent, a bad KGB agent. They'd drill him with questions. They'd try to trip him up with... The very first week, he was lying outright to them, misleading them in any direction he could. But then on about day 7 of the interrogations, one of the KGB officers comes inside with a copy of the New York Times, and he yells at my father and says, "You've lied to us. You told us that you were trained in Arizona. The New York Times says that you were trained in Nevada at Area 51. You might as well tell us everything, or else we'll get it out of your American press anyways."
Powers' trial began on his 31st birthday. He walked into the courtroom through a gauntlet of flashbulbs and news cameras. His 3-day show trial had little to do with his flight and much to do with Soviet-American relations. "I realized," he said later, "that the trial would not be USSR versus Francis Gary Powers, but the USSR versus the U.S. and, incidentally, Francis Gary Powers." The guilty verdict, prepared before the trial by Soviet authorities, concluded that his flight had been ordered to torpedo the Paris summit and to prevent the easing of international tension. His sentence? 10 years in prison. With Powers locked away, wild rumors swirled. A London paper published an article claiming he would be released from prison and had decided to live in the Soviet Union. Self-styled military experts surmised that he had been flying too low, and others criticized him for not killing himself. For more than a year and a half, Powers languished. In February 1962, the Russians suddenly transported him to East Germany. In a safe house in East Berlin, the KGB informed him that if all went well, he would be released the next day. On February 10th, at the Guideline Bridge separating East and West Berlin, Powers walked to freedom in exchange for Colonel Rudolf Abel, a Soviet spy. Powers came back to a country that had its doubts about his conduct. Though he had apparently given away no secrets, rumor and speculation remained. Hero or bum, asked one headline. Should he, like Nathan Hale, have died for his country?
And he was always upset that the American government didn't do more to help clear his name at the time.
Upon his return to the United States, he was interrogated by the CIA as if he were an enemy. He took and passed polygraph tests to make sure he was not a double agent. And the final report on his ordeal damned him with the faint praise that he had only probably withheld national security information from the Soviets. Concerned about the speculation, President Kennedy canceled a White House ceremony to welcome Powers home. When Powers wrote a book telling his side of the story, the CIA suppressed its publication. Francis Gary Powers died in August 1977. After the end of the Cold War, the only war Powers ever fought in, declassified Soviet documents made clear that his behavior in captivity was nothing less than heroic. On May 1st, 2000, the 40th anniversary of his final flight over the Soviet Union, he was awarded the Prisoner of War Medal, the Distinguished Flying Cross, and the CIA Medal of Valor. The boy from Kentucky, who had wanted to fly and to be a hero, finally was. And that is why he is a legend of air power.
President Eisenhower promoted an open skies policy to permit reconnaissance overflights. The Soviets declined. However, the proposal was not simply a polite inquiry. It was also an effective declaration of intent. The U.S. would be taking a look at whatever was there, no matter what the residents might think. The nuclear stakes were seen as too high to permit any other course. All that was needed was a plane to do the job.
In the early 1950s, the United States had a real requirement to overfly Russia to find out the status of their development of long-range missiles. There was no airplane in the United States or in the world that could safely overfly Russia at that time. Lockheed made an unsolicited proposal to Trevor Gardner, the Undersecretary for Research and Development for the Air Force, on a very specialized airplane. We promised to build within 8 months 20 airplanes for $22 million, including spares, that would do the job required. The program was turned over to the CIA, who then chose Mr. Richard Bissell, an economist, to run the program. Richard Bissell became a very good engineer, and he not only was our director on the U-2 program, but he also followed through with the development of the Mach 3 Blackbird.
When I first met Kelly, I had been working for nearly a year for Allen Dulles. I joined Allen's organization early in 1954. Toward the end of November, I was summoned one afternoon into Allen's office, and I was told, with absolutely no prior warning or knowledge, that one day previously, President Eisenhower had approved a project involving the development of an extremely high-altitude aircraft to be used for surveillance and intelligence collection over denied areas in Europe, Russia, and elsewhere. We had, on the basis of Kelly's proposal, an almost impossible schedule to meet. It was almost impossible for Lockheed, but I can assure you that it was also an extremely tight schedule working within the bureaucracy.
The mission of the plane to overfly the USSR dictated several things. First, it would have to fly very high, to be outside the range of interceptors and anti-aircraft weapons. It would also need a very long range. There would obviously be no fuel stops en route. These two aims complemented each other. Being out of range, the plane did not need to go particularly fast and could cruise economically. The shape which emerged as that of a glider, with extraordinarily large high-aspect wings, and reflecting an obsession with weight conservation. The prototype arrived at Groom Lake Test Site on the 29th of July 1955. Kelly Johnson's impossible self-imposed schedule was met. The plane flew on time. As part of the secrecy, the designation U-2 was intended to give nothing away. The U stood ambiguously for utility. In fact, the U-2 has performed many roles in addition to its primary espionage function. World utility has proved over time to actually be a fair description. The U-2 is a demanding plane to fly. There are many things about maneuvering this powered glider in extremely thin air at great altitude that are not applicable to flying any other aircraft. For example, at altitude, there is only a very narrow envelope between its stall speed and its entry into transonic flight, the point at which supersonic airflow over the wings begins. In the U-2 at 70,000 feet, these 2 points were about 12 knots apart. Below 400 knots, you would fall out of the sky looking for denser air. Above 412 knots, your wing might come off. This is a very restricting slot to occupy. Over the years, with increased gloat and more powerful engines, the gap actually narrowed to less than 5 miles an hour. Given the stress of the missions and the fragile nature of the planes, Kelly Johnson did not expect the U-2 to have a long lifespan, particularly when frustrated Soviets concentrated their attention on knocking it down, as they most certainly would. However, the design has proved to be enduring, and the very unusual step was taken in 1979 of restarting production, and the plane was rechristened the TR-1. The TR-1 maintains the design and abilities of the U-2. The aircraft that Kelly Johnson's team produced provided a solution that is as valid today as it was in 1954. Of course, optical cameras were no longer primary loads of the U-2s or TR-1s, which now fly electronic and communications intelligence missions using their high flying capability and small size. But these technological spying measures were not the original reason for the U-2s, and, in the 50s, that reason to overfly Russian territory, carrying cameras and taking photos, was a priority. But as the likelihood of Russians developing weapons to shoot U-2s down increased, so did the urgency of replacing them. A new plane was needed, one that could fly much faster. If one was no longer protected by being out of range of interception, then one needed to be able to outrun it.
About a year after that first flight in 1956, I came to the conclusion that we should start working on the successor to the U-2, because it was clear to me that sooner or later the U-2 would be vulnerable to interception. It was not a matter of simply commissioning the final design and production of an aircraft that was within, although at the edge of the state of the art, as had been the case with the U-2. This time, it was a really pioneering effort.
Where did it come from? Let's follow this transport plane and find out. This is the desert of western Nevada, already well known for its nuclear tests by the Atomic Energy Commission here at Yucca Flats. Adjoining this AEC test site is an active aerial gunnery range. Early in 1955, by presidential order, 60 square miles of this prohibited area were set aside for a special purpose. There's a narrow air corridor to reach this spot on the map. Air charts order closed to all personnel and aircraft except on orders from the Chief of Staff, U.S. Air Force. The name of this isolated spot in Nevada is Watertown, and its very isolation is of the greatest importance. The specialists that come off this transport are hand-picked. They are checked every time they arrive at Watertown. Overall security in this area is the highest yet to be maintained in this country, even higher than that of the Manhattan Project. Selection of Watertown was dictated by several unique considerations. The area is isolated from prying eyes by the AEC range, with lethal reminders of past atomic explosions. AEC guards maintain regular patrols. Supplies destined for Watertown channel into the area through regular AEC routes. Watertown radio and teletype communications, the Angel is referred to as an article. Her pilots are called drivers. The geographical spot of Groom Lake is called home plate. The Angel was designed to do a single job, obtain the largest amount of reconnaissance information ever collected on any single flight. For the first time in jet history, it is possible to inspect 400 square miles with a single cartographic photograph. For the first time in jet history, sensitive electronic equipment is being carried to heights where it can search for any number of radio, TV, or radar signals and record this information for detailed analysis. There are already 12 alternate equipment loads for the U-2. Development of the Angel and the information gathering equipment that it carries is the result of the most experienced judgment applied at every critical point. A select group of capable, dedicated men in industry and government, working with trust and cooperation, completed this specific project at the utmost speed. The idea for the Angel itself was born when Lockheed started a design study on the maximum altitude possible from a jet airframe for reconnaissance purposes. The Angel, then called the CL-282, took sufficient form to be presented as a proposal. Members of the Killian Committee, a portion of the scientific advisory group, defined the technical feasibility and urgency of the program. The optical and photographic concepts were envisioned by Dr. James Baker and Dr. Edwin H. Land. The original CL-282 proposal was then modified to produce even more spectacular results. On December 9, 1954, the go-ahead was given, and Lockheed's chief engineer, Kelly Johnson, called together his tiny 26-man Special Projects Engineering Group. Here were the problems they faced: to design, build an airplane, and fly it in 8 months. An airplane that would cruise well above 70,000 feet. One that would travel almost as far as a B-52 and remain in the air for 10 hours. A plane that would be completely reliable, with forced landings out of the question. A plane that would be the world's most stable aircraft for high-altitude photography. A plane that would be flexible in concept, to carry at least 12 different equipment loads and have no one penalize the others in weight. A plane that would weigh only 1 1/2 times the weight of the power plant. Weight was the critical factor in the whole project. Designers said they would trade their collective grandmothers for 10 pounds of empty weight. Pounds, in fact, were called grandmothers. But weight could not be saved at the expense of reliability, a real engineering challenge, met with proven know-how and a basic design so simple that it was almost revolutionary. The Angel is simplicity itself. All control surfaces are cable-operated. The tail section of the fuselage attaches with only 3 bolts. The inside of the 80-foot wing is just 4 big fuel tanks. The interior of the fuselage is plain and uncluttered. The cockpit canopy, stressed to handle a pressure differential of 5 pounds per square inch, is operated by hand. The pant leg engine intake ducts presented a problem. At altitude, near-perfect ram air distribution was needed to keep the engine running. The final intake on the Angel gives as good pressure distribution as would be found in a power plant wind tunnel. A unique gust relieving feature was designed into the wing of the Angel to reduce tail loads and wing bending in turbulence. The flaps tilt 4 degrees upward, and the ailerons tilt 10 degrees to completely change the airfoil characteristics. During development of the Angel, Kelly Johnson met with each member of the Special Projects Group at 7 every morning. Any problems occurring on the previous day were discussed and corrective decisions were made immediately. Subcontracting was virtually impossible. 87% of the prototype Angel was fabricated in one building in Burbank. Components were run through the company's big presses at night and on Sundays, then hidden from day shift workers. The C&J Manufacturing Company, for Clarence Johnson, was formed in an unmarked downtown warehouse to handle shipments from vendors in unmarked trucks. Designers of the Angel couldn't even get into a high-speed wind tunnel, so calculations were made with computers. 50% of production took place in this building at Bakersfield. At peak production of the 50 U-2s, only 600 people were involved, just 1 man in every 60 on the Lockheed payroll. The Angels were completely assembled here, checked out, disassembled, and shrouded in canvas for airlift to Watertown. Fuel and hydraulic fluid were added for the first time at Watertown, and the Angels were tested by company pilots. Because of its long, thin wings, the Angel has been referred to as a jet glider. It has the world's most efficient lift-drag ratio for powered aircraft, 25.6 to 1. That's better than many competition sailplanes. From 70,000 feet, the Angel can glide 300 miles without power. The engine for this aircraft was originally the Pratt & Whitney J57-37, a 10,500-pound thrust unit built for the B-52. A later 11,500-pound version, known as the -31, was developed specifically for the Angel. Pratt & Whitney President Jack Horner and Chief Engineer Wright Parkins crammed a normal 3-year engine development program into 12 months. The new engine has a 16-stage compressor, with 9 stages in the low range and 7 in the high-pressure chamber. The low-range compressor is driven by a hollow shaft and turns at a lower speed than the high compressors. The Pratt & Whitney engine operates at full power for the duration of the flight. At sea level, this unit gulps nearly 9,000 pounds of fuel per hour. At 70,000 feet, this drops to 700 pounds per hour. At 74,600 feet, the engine will quit from oxygen starvation. In early stages of the program, as many as 6 flameouts occurred on a single flight. With the new fuel system and turbine design of the -31 engine, flameouts have ceased to be a critical problem. An improved ignition system ensures air restarts at high altitudes. In the first 20 months that the Angel flew, logging over 5,000 hours in the air, there were just 2 forced landings away from Watertown. Both planes, equipped with the older -37 engines, landed at Kirkland Air Force Base, Albuquerque, New Mexico. After each development flight, a careful accounting is made of fuel consumption. A special fuel dubbed lighter fluid was developed by Shell Oil Company specifically for the Angel, and the finished product was shipped to Nevada in tank cars labeled LF-1A. This blend will not boil at the low pressures encountered at altitude, yet will still give adequate air starts. It is so involatile that fire seldom follows a mishap. A simple 100-gallon slipper tank has been developed to fit each wing for extremely long flights. These pressurized tanks contain enough fuel to carry the Angel to cruising altitude, where they have no significant effect on speed or range. Even after the addition of an external drag chute, 3 times the normal oxygen supply, improved braking, and an autopilot, the final all-up weight was within 10 pounds of the original proposal. The Angel exceeded original performance limits in both ceiling and range. When the prototype Angel was flown across Death Valley to Watertown, Lockheed also found itself in the transportation business. Their own DC-3 made almost daily flights to Watertown with a hand-picked crew of flight line mechanics. The first unofficial name for Watertown was Paradise Ranch. This description was dreamed up tongue-in-cheek to encourage key personnel to accept assignment on this special project before they could be told what it involved. Anyone for golf? Many newcomers guessed that the project involved an atomic-powered aircraft and were astonished to find that they were to work with... 2 days later, in a rainstorm, the Angel went to 8,000 feet. That day it took 5 attempts to land the plane because it would fly on idle engine thrust. The unusual bicycle landing gear, designed for the lightest possible structure, weighs 257 pounds. A conventional gear on a comparable aircraft would weigh 750 pounds and take room out of the wings that is vital for fuel. Wing-mounted pogos drop off during takeoff, again in the interest of saving weight. Weight and space that paid off in an extra 1,500 feet of altitude and 100 miles in cruising radius. As the operation at Watertown grew in scope, more transportation was required. A daily military air transport shuttle system was begun with C-54s from Burbank. In bad weather, one of these transports crashed into Charleston Peak, a few miles north of Las Vegas. 14 members of the Watertown project were aboard. The program has not been without other casualties. One Angel crashed at Watertown. Another disintegrated over an Indian village named Wide Ruin in Arizona. A third, with Lockheed pilot Robert Seeker aboard, disappeared near Watertown. By the time this plane was found, some information about the project at Watertown reached the public. This nearly 3 years after its conception. That dust cloud is an actual crash. Rescue crews rush to the end of the runway where an Angel has landed short. The pilot here was uninjured, but emergency crews take no chances with leaking fuel. Salvage operations mean that this fallen Angel will soon fly again to rejoin its sister ships already in the air. This project has had fewer mishaps than is normal with new aircraft, yet unique ground handling equipment designed solely for the Angel operates as well at this crash scene as it does on the flight line. Not all the difficulties at Watertown have come from the Angel herself. Extremes in weather, wind, sand and heat, snow, cloudburst, biting cold, an ever-present headache, but the Angels must be ready for tomorrow's flight. It's almost all work and no play for the temporary desert dwellers at Watertown. Just 72 airline miles distant is Las Vegas. However, none of Watertown's workers can visit these bright lights. or refreshing scenery. Security is just that rigid. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, volleyball, pool, a 16mm movie, and a tiny converted mess hall are just about the only diversions. Those who remain over a weekend may explore long deserted gold mines. Remnants from another era of rugged desert pioneers. Here, as seen by few men, is what the world looks like from 70,000 feet. These scenes were photographed over Arizona by Ray Gowdy, one of the 5 Lockheed test pilots who have handled all development and production testing of the Angel. Training of new pilots begins with the T-33 for familiarization flights. The pilot must be able to hold the T-bird inches in the air for the length of the lake, so that he will be able to hold the Angel at the same altitude until its broad wings lose all their lift. This mastered, he graduates to the Angel and transition landings on the dry lake. A chase car and chase plane, both with two-way radio, are used during this phase of training. Seat belts in the chase car are good insurance. The new Angel pilot makes at least 3 landings with the pogos installed. She's a little easier to handle that way. Takeoffs are smooth from Groom Lake. A wide circle as the chase plane plays Follow the Leader. Now turn in on final approach, says the instructor in the chase plane. Your airspeed is 92 knots. The chase car pulls into line and picks up speed. He's leveling off just a little high. And at 72 knots, here comes the stall. The best way to land the Angel is in a full stall, just like the old-fashioned airplanes with tail wheels. The broad, dry lake at Watertown makes an ideal location for this type of transition training. After the landings improve, the pogo safety pins are removed, and the new pilot is on his own. Sometimes the drivers taxi right up to the hangar doors. Not bad at all for an airplane that's supposed to be hard to handle on the ground. After a number of day flights, the new Angel pilots are ready for night transition and long cross-country flights. It's no accident that the complete Angel and all its intricate cargo can be disassembled and packed quickly, ready for airborne transport. Everything about the Angel can go aboard a cargo plane. Cameras in their dog houses, engines, lab equipment and supply, ground support equipment, and of course the Angel, the result of foresight and planning, engineering, precise and rapid manufacture. That's it, what it is and what it can do. A vital chapter in modern American achievement. From the desert wastelands of Watertown, it's but a matter of hours to anywhere in the world where reconnaissance might be desired. The most important airplane, the most important cargo in the air today is in this single package, the Inquisitive Angel.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.